Okay.
Yeah.
All right, we're on. um, this is going to be good because Tom Schnauber and I have a colleague in common. We're going to talk about Henry Temianka, a wonderful violinist and conductor, and just cosmopolitan, brilliant,
Oh,
wonderful man in Los
yeah.
Angeles. And that's going to be part of our conversation about your CD. It's a 2017 Quartz music release, Tom Schnauber, Death and Waltzes. And it's much prettier than it sounds, folks. Works, sorry, the noisy cars. It's a Monday night, I guess. Anyway, works composed between 1995 and 2014. And in this case, this CD is, and we'll talk a little bit about arranging, about decisions you've made from earlier versions of the pieces. This is meant for string orchestra, and the orchestra in question is conductor Mitya Rashlevsky. I hope I'm pronouncing Rashlevsky, conducting the Russian String Orchestra. Beautiful, beautiful playing, and a beautiful CD. And what I love, my function, I hope, is for so many musicians out there that watch the interviews and have a look at what's going on and what I have to say about CDs, is finding amazing repertoire. I hope I'm doing I'm being helpful there, Tom, because this is, if for conductors and instrumentalists looking for string orchestra repertoire, there are some beauties on this CD. First, that now I get to let you talk a little bit, and Al will mention the pieces. It's interesting. My German will be profoundly stressed, but I'm going to give it a shot anyway. Why not? And you'll correct me. But first, let's just talk about who you are. I mean, you have your PhD from the University of Michigan, and now the little backstory, which is kind of an interesting German-American history. Tell us.
Well, yeah, I identify, I suppose you want to say that, as a German-American composer, primarily because although I was born in the United States, my father was German, my mother was American, but speaks fluent German, and so I grew up speaking both languages. I spent a lot of my childhood in the German-speaking part of Europe, so Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and I have dual citizenship, and I still have family in Germany, and so I sort of take aspects of both cultures whenever I do pretty much anything, but especially musically. It was my father who really got me into music, and we were very much a sort of Bach to Brahms household. I don't even think I heard jazz or any rock music from actually until my sister had her rebellious phase and she played tapes by Cyndi Lauper and Wham. Um, and then I started hearing that stuff. And then I had a really good friend who introduced me to sort of non-classical music. So I came to what most people grow up in. I came to that actually quite a bit later. So I grew up in a very Germanic, in generally the best sense of the word, household.
Okay, let me jump in because I'm the pure classicist.
Mm,
And I'm a Yankee. I'm an American. I don't even have a sort of European mixed heritage, living world of speaking German and French, and no, but straight laced. I'm an orchestra conductor. From 13, it was nothing but
mm,
classical music, and I was horrified at several points in my life. I'll try and only take about 30 seconds here to see that younger musicians were going astray and had been
mm,
so severely and terribly, I feared, influenced by this rock and roll stuff and all this others. I mean, I was just as square as it can be, and I'm catching up now, and I've mellowed considerably. And by the way, all younger composers and musicians, I can speak from my 72 years, everything's younger than 72, are so well informed about so much stuff, and they can do so much. So it's brilliant, this mixing of cultures. So if I understand, you started in a strictly Germanic Bach to Brahms kind of environment, and then kind of drifted away. It came to popular music a bit later.
I did, although I have to say, if desert island, it would still be mostly Bach to Brahms for me.
Oh, thank you. You have
It's
risen in my esteem considerably.
well, it's all what you grow up with, right? Bach to Brahms, and then what I call I don't know if you call it a guilty pleasure because I'm not that guilty about it, but 20th century German operetta. So Lehar, Kalaman, that sort of stuff too.
That's a little, that's almost kinky, but we'll talk about that some
Well,
other time. And let me mention just the pieces that are on the CD. And again, what I'm speaking to is, there is some wonderful stuff. I hope everybody out there that are conductors and string players and string orchestra players will this all goes up on performingartsreview.net and so on. But, there are some beauties. Here's one of them. The opening piece, Finds. Four wonderful, beautifully, beautifully descriptive movements. Heather, as in the herb, air, gem, and relic. We will talk about that piece because there is so much going on there, and we'll speak about a mentor or a very important person in your life in terms of this CD anyway. Second, here goes. I'm going to do the English first to save myself. The heaviest fetters, die schwersten Fesseln.
Close. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Too gracious of you. Too gracious. And then it goes on. Nach der verlauten Toten, Night of the Transfigured Dead. And that's a beauty. I'm going to want to talk about it.
Okay.
Right? Okay. Dona Nobis Pacem, again for strings. Ziegenfußtanz, goat dance.
Ziegenfußtanz.
Ziegenfußtanz. Thank you so much. Goat Dance from 2014. In memory of Henry Tamiaka, we'll spend a little special time there. Tell me about this piece, Leroy, and you are going to have to tell us about Leroy. And Eiswalzer, too. I hope I was close there. Tell me it was Eiswalzer.
Eiswalzer. No, you were right.
Okay. Oh, and then the last piece, which is also very, very interesting and very touching, and I want you to speak to it. Nachwort, die Harfe.
That was good. Yes.
Afterward, the harp, and what what a touching afterward on this CD. We'll get there. Excuse me. Now let me rush up to my questions here, and we'll get this thing going. We did have a little talk about your past, that German American thing, and when you say culture, that's a serious thing. Obviously, you were influenced heavily by that powerful European, and Germany is certainly a great representative. All that powerful, wonderful culture from Northern European culture. So it's there, and also in your music, which is I think I mentioned to you off camera. There's narrative and there's narrative, and there are I review composers whose narratives are very clear and wonderful and marvelous, and it's all great. And then there are composers such as yourself, because of your perhaps that Germanic thing, whose streams run deeper, shall we say discreetly, I have a feeling. And also you have a wonderful use of narrative. Let's talk about this man. Let me get down to this man. We can't get into the music without an understanding of musicologist Johannes von Marland, 1890 to 2014, which means, and I...
Oh, he's still alive.
He's still alive? Oh, Johannes, I'm so sorry. You're kidding. So he must be 112? What?
Yeah, at least. Sure. Yeah.
Now, who's pulling whose leg? And by the way, everybody, this man is capable of pulling some legs, musically, I do believe, from what I've heard. Go ahead.
So, Johannes von Marland is basically my alter ego. You mentioned narrative. I'm a composer who needs, pretty much for everything that I said, who needs some kind of story, some kind of either literal tale or at least something that creates an emotional journey, because that's what I like music to do. And if I'm setting text, songs, I've written a lot of songs. There's none of those on the CD, but I've done a lot of text, and of course the text then supplies that. But if I'm writing music without text, I find that I often, in order to be able to create, to write the piece, to craft it, I need some kind of story. And I found out in the early 2000s that a great way to do that was to create this character, this musicologist who's loosely based on a number of people that I've known and people that I've read about. His first name, my first son, Johannes, just happened to have been born around then, so I used his first name, and von Marland literally means from the land of fables or the land of stories. So whenever I needed a story, I would sort of inhabit his character and then come up with something that happened to him. And often the narrative I would outline the narrative as a written story before then going on and writing the music. And then I figured they always want you to do program notes. And I figured, well, he's actually a great character also for program notes and just for describing a piece. And so I created this diary that he's writing in, and to explain to people the one drawback to him is that sometimes people actually do think that he's real. There is, for instance, I wrote it's not on this CD, but I wrote a concerto for bass and orchestra, for string bass and orchestra. And I had this whole long narrative about this fellow von Merland discovering this old piece from the Middle Ages that was written for an instrument that didn't really exist, and all the stuff that I needed, and I just put that in the program notes. And a number of people after this one concert, before him, came up to me and said, "Wow, what an amazing discovery! It's just, this story is incredible." And I didn't have the heart to tell them that I made it all up, so I just said, "Yeah, it's a great thing."
Okay, let me jump in at this point. I fell for it, hook, line, and sinker.
Oh, okay, all right, I wasn't sure.
Hook, line, and sinker, and I should have known better, because at your website is your blog. And you also make no bones about being a writer, as I recall from browsing your website. And I'm a musician, but I write reviews and I create wonderful, glorious sentences and all that. I'm a writer. I should have known better, and I fell for it. Hook, total, line, and sinker. So therefore, because the notes I made to myself now, if I can, I've done the flagellation, right? I'm okay. I'm bleeding.
Right.
I've done. Done the self-flagellation, but because my notes, when I started to read, and there was some, and may I congratulate you, Maestro Merland, because beautiful writing, but also my notes to myself, and this explains it now, almost magic realist, I said to myself, because, and we're in fines right now, okay?
Right.
Let's do it. We're good. Let me read a little bit, and then you can help us understand that this is all a ruse by yourself, and it's absolutely unforgivable and gorgeous and magnificent, okay? So I get to read again. I love reading. This is from the diary of the eminent musicologist Johannes von Merland, 1890, and still apparently alive in some shape, form, or other, transmogrification of some kind. This is from May 2nd, 2014. He was extremely particular, apparently. Quote, "I was hiking along in the woods east of town. At the forest's edge was a heather." That's the first little segment of these 4 glorious pieces, finds. At the edge of the woods was a heather, a vibrantly colorful field of flowers and insects, all of which were dancing a jig, in and out of and around each other, a bright, pulsating tumble of a dance that I watched with a smile of fascination. And you have just exactly described what you wrote.
Right.
It's brilliant. It's so much fun. Heather, irresistibly optimistic. These are my notes about Heather. This is just maybe 4 minutes, I think? A little over 3 minutes. That movement, irresistibly optimistic for strings. Remember, everybody, it just has this contagiously tuneful and positive. It's just a jolly, gorgeous, wonderful piece that every string orchestra should be playing. Okay, whatever I say, right? So next movement, air. Let's see but that was not quite the quote. What I was doing. Let me try and find. Why I thought for a minute this genius was some kind of magic realist. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. This is about Relic, the last little wonderful piece that describes once I reached the high, cold mountains, I came upon a small ice cave. As I inhaled the thin air. What are you doing in music? You should have 7 novels to your credit right now. As I inhaled the thin air, I looked around the cave. Pay attention, everybody. Embedded in one of the walls was a waltz, a relic from an earlier time. It was a bit distorted in places, somewhat twisted from years of being frozen in slowly moving ice, but it was still recognizable. I tried to free it, but could only get part of it out. I listened and danced a bit as it swirled away into the purple sky. I do not know what to say. I have no idea. I mean, what kind of descriptive word structures are these? It's brilliant. It really is brilliant. And your music is exactly the same.
Well, good. I'm glad. Sometimes I wonder I worry that the music can't quite live up to the description sometimes.
Well, this is
But
what I meant earlier about this this Germanic American thing. In other words, high culture. I hope it doesn't sound racist or anything. I don't mean it to be so, but you know what I mean. This is high European culture
well,
that you found.
I mean, it's a culture, and in my own personal life, my father was a literature professor, and my mother had her master's degree in literature. So we just read a lot, and stories were just part of how I grew up. So it's also just the personal culture in that regard.
It's
And a lot of the
absolutely
stories
incredible. My
a
esteem
lot of
for
the
you.
stories. Yeah.
I think earlier
Oh, so,
my esteem rose pretty highly at the beginning of the conversation. It's going even higher now that I realize you are a brilliant writer. And we all know, you and I know anyway, it ain't easy. Even a review, 6, 7,
right.
8 hours. And the
Oh, yeah.
reason is not because you're out of ideas, it's about how to make words work.
Hmm. Well,
Okay?
music. I mean, to me, writing words and writing music, there really isn't that much of a difference because you're still crafting, you're still dealing with rhythm, you're dealing with phrasing, you're dealing with sonic images, in a lot of ways in both. So I mean, I approach the two, writing words and writing music, pretty much the same way. Just the craft is a little different, but the emotion and the the impulse and that's very much the same.
And the power of words in
Mhm.
description and also music. So I mean, you're really a master at both, which is fabulous. I mean, so this CD was, I grange around. I look around to see if something jumps out at me and is of interest. And I saw your CD, and the cover is arresting, shall we say?
Yeah.
The cover design is quite arresting, and I thought, A, who is that? And B, what is this? And I'm so glad I made this discovery. We're just speaking of granging around. I'm just kind of looking through some of the pieces on the CD. Why don't we talk about what kind of a composer you are? Because there are all kinds of kind of generic things. I mean, part of me thinks cinematically, of course, because your
Hmm.
narrative is so cinematic and so descriptive. So I hear wonderful film music, if you'll forgive me and or allow that kind of
Yeah.
to me, compliment. Um, and again, description. I'm thinking of Ziegenfußtanz. Did I do it? Ziegenfußtanz. I'll
Siegen.
never get it right. I'll never get
That's
it right. And the umlauts, forget it. Anyway, goat-footed dance.
right.
I went in thinking what it is fun. It's optimistic. It's gentle and delicious and charming and extremely accessible. This wonderful little waltz, and it has its little cattywampus moments. Of course, it's this goat-footed, this left-footed, as you describe yourself being left-footed thing. But what a charming little piece for strings that everybody can understand.
Hmm.
Bingo.
Yeah.
I don't want to talk about Henry Temyanka just yet. Maybe we'll go out with that. How am I doing time with? Oh, we got plenty of time. At least for me, I think we got plenty of time.
Oh, yeah. I can do
Let's
this tonight.
let's talk about this wonderful use of string orchestra and oboe as narrator.
Mhm.
And the title of the piece is "Tell Me About This Piece, Leroy," or Leroy, for oboe and strings.
Mm.
It's just marvelous. Also kind of nature-like somehow in the terms of kind of what I was hearing. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, but tell me about, it's in the program booklet, but tell me about Leroy, and I've frankly forgotten his last name.
Yeah, Southers, Leroy Southers. He was mid, I'd call him a mid 20th century composer of I don't know if Americana is the right word, but very much in the flavor and style of composers like William Schumann and Harris and people like that. And he was also, when I was an undergraduate at the University of Southern California, he taught there. He taught theory mostly, but he became a mentor to many of us young composers, or I don't know if it was many, but a handful, say about 5 or 6 of us. And he was just an amazing musician. He had a record collection, and of course in those days it was literally records, LPs, about 10,000 of them. And the thing about him is he knew every single one of them. he had this catalog for a memory, but it was also very he was very emotive and very emotional when he talked about music. So we would go up to his house. He would invite us over. We would spend weekends there, and we just spend all night listening to music. And he would bring out one LP after another and do comparative listening, or pieces that we as young composers had not heard. And he was also a chain smoker, so he would always have a cigarette while he was talking. And then we'd start listening to the music, and he would just sort of conduct along with the cigarette in his hand, and the smoke would be wafting and sort of dancing with the music that we were listening to. And he would give us historical background, and all off the top of his head. And he was just a marvelous person, an amazing musician, and his own music is very, very good too. There's very few recordings of it. He was like me, a terrible self-promoter. So he just wrote and wrote and wrote, and he certainly didn't get the recognition I think he deserved as a composer.
Is it in the USC? Is it in the USC library by any chance? Did he leave his work to USC?
It's not. His music, from what I heard, he left USC. He moved to New Hampshire. I went and visited him there a few times when I was in grad school. He died exact year. It was in the early 2000s. And his music went to his children, whom I never knew, and I honestly have no idea what's happened to it. I have one score of his, and there's one CD available with a piece of his. I have an old record of another piece by him. But he was just an inspiration to me, and he was an oboe player too. So that's why I chose the oboe. So after he died, I wrote this piece sort of in memory of him. And I think your observation that it was, I think you used, I can't remember what word you used exactly, but I sort of used the word pastoral, the kind of pastoral nature of the strings in the background. And in the piece, again, it was this narrative. I wrote the string part first as just this kind of pastoral memory piece, and then wrote the sort of put the oboe piece, or the oboe part, on top of it, as if it were Leroy commenting on the piece that the strings are playing.
What a wonderful tribute! What a wonderful tribute!
And since then, since this recording, there's a second movement to that now, which unfortunately I hadn't written when we recorded this CD. So now the whole piece is called Dr. Leroy's Dirge and Dance.
Do you think it might have other movements in time?
I think two will do it. It pretty much the second movement now, as it exists, is a little longer, and it's a little bit more upbeat. It's a dance with the oboe and the strings. So, but at the time we did the CD, I just had that first part written.
Yeah, so it goes.
Mm-hmm.
So well, it is gorgeous. By the way, some very high oboe writing.
Which
makes for a delicious, almost spine-tingling color up there. Maybe something emphatic about one of his analyses or something. But that was really touching, and the piece is gorgeous. Really gorgeous throughout. This is my general compliment to you. And these days, this is good. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? We're kind of over. I think we're over that period. Remember when it was like, well, if it was pretty, something's wrong.
Yeah, there was. I mean, I remember as an undergrad, there was this pressure, and it didn't actually come from any of my teachers, because even as an undergrad, my teachers were not I guess you'd call them hardcore European modernist types who felt like what you were talking about. But there was still this, I still remember the pressure at that time to write music that was, I guess you call it edgy, dissonant.
Academic, perhaps?
Well, maybe just a certain sound to it. And I have to say, I have nothing against, there are some of my favorite pieces are hardcore modernist 12 tonal
Sure.
or serial, some pieces that I truly love. I just can't be expressive in that language myself, right? I know other composers can, and I enjoy listening to composers who can be very expressive using that musical language. I can't.
But I'm glad we're past a moment where you might have been looked at a little more
Right.
lower. I hope we're not getting into too awful an area here, but I mean,
No,
honestly, melody has returned, everybody. It's glorious.
and I find that at least in most contemporary popular music, I'm talking about the mainstream popular music, and I hear a lot of it because my kids listen to it. One of the things that I very miss in that music is melody. Now, they have tunes, but the tunes are, to me, very flat. The contours are flat. The contrasts in parts of the melody are really not there. So oddly enough, it seems like contemporary classical music or jazz is where melodies are now to be found again, even though we went through this period, as you said, where, yeah, if you wrote something that just sounded like a tune, there was something wrong with it. But I mean, I can tell you probably the single most revelatory moment for me as a composition student was in my first year of graduate school at the University of Michigan. I studied with William Albright. I don't know if that's a name that's familiar to everyone.
Maybe vaguely.
Well, he was, a composer and also a pianist. He was part of the ragtime revival of the 70s with people like Bolcom and a few other people whose names now are flying right out of my head. But it was my first session with him, and I was working on a piece. It was a setting of E. Cummings poetry for women's choir and a couple of instruments. And the text I had chosen sounded to me a little swing-like. So I started writing this, but I felt, of course, God, I can't just write swing music. God, it's got to be complicated. And so I would bring this stuff to him, and he kind of looked at it, and he finally said, he looked at it, he could play through it. He was a good pianist. And he finally looked at me and said, if you think this sounds like jazz, just write jazz. And I was like,
so I
can do that. He said, yeah, of course, dude. So it was this liberating moment to me, where as a composer of my generation and of course the generations after me, where it was, if you wanted to write in a particular style, just write in that style. And even on the CD, you probably noticed, some pieces are just flat out tonal, right? No, they would have been written, 150 years ago, and other pieces have a little bit more edge to them. It just depends on what my mood is and what the piece needs to be.
Yes, for example, Dona Nobis Pacem,
Mm-hmm.
for us piece. It's minimalist, if you will, in that sense that it floats and hovers in meditation, as the kind of the way I hear it. Beautiful little tune, little fragment, and then it gets lush, and it reminds me a little bit, and I hope it's horrible to say to a composer that but it reminds me a little bit of Goritsky in that idea of contemplating every nanosecond of sound, the way you set up this meditative state. Just as an example on this, and again with strings, it's just a beautiful transforming. Very emotional piece. I loved it. It's quite empathic and passionate, I say to myself in my notes, whatever that means. But where you, the listener, are just kind of drawn, you can't help but be drawn into the sonorities of the sound areas. Sorry, I got a phone going off that you've created. So just as an idea, let's do in memory of Henry Temiaka, shall we? You and I have that man in common. Why don't I'm just going to touch on mine, and then you fill us in on the whole thing, because you and I saw the same places. We were in the same studios. We did some similar tasks. I was working with Henry Temianka as a conducting student, but the same thing, where you do the research, you listen to all the rehearsal tapes. Henry Temianka was conductor of the California Chamber Symphony in Los Angeles and founder of, and I keep forgetting the name of the string quartet,
The Paganini Quartet.
Paganini Quartet,
Yeah.
in the 1950s. Brilliant violinist. I learned so much about bowing technique from him, although I fought him every inch of the way. Of course, I'm a clarinetist. It was gibberish to me, but he and others, when teachers make you stick to something until you want to kill them, it's 20 years later that you go, oh, that's why.
Right.
Tell us about In Memory of Henry Temianka.
Well, the piece, I'll swing back to the piece is in a way what started this whole CD and the whole project. I'll get to that a little later. So I was 16 years old and living in California, and at the time I was still in high school. And I was the music in the music program in high school. I was in the band and in the orchestra, and I don't know how, but someone got me in touch with this. It was called the California Chamber Symphony, which at the time I had no idea who that was. So this director named Henry Temianka, honestly, at the time I didn't know who he was, but they needed someone to help them out with their library, and I guess they just wanted a young music-oriented student whom they could, pay minimum wage and who could come and work part-time. And so I went and I met him. And again, at the time, I didn't know who he was. He just seemed like this sort of quirky old man to me. But I took the job, and it was basically being the librarian for the California Chamber Symphony, which at this time, this was in the mid to late 80s. It was starting to wind down, he wasn't doing the large performances anymore. He was doing mostly chamber performances where he would organize it, but he wasn't really conducting anymore, and he wasn't playing anymore, but he was still very active. So I went in there and I started cataloging the scores, and that then developed into, he took a real liking to me. So then even when they left their offices or moved the offices to his big home in Brentwood, I went along and started also being his personal librarian, cataloging his books and his personal scores and everything. And he became sort of a mentor. I was a budding composer, and he always encouraged me. And one of the first substantial pieces I wrote was for solo violin. So of course he was enormously helpful there as well. And he and his wife Emmy, I would usually go on the weekends, do my work. We'd take a break for lunch. They would make lunch, or sometimes we'd go out for lunch, where we'd sit out in that wonderful backyard with that fig tree I mentioned. Then I'd go back to work. So I'd put there, maybe about 5-6 hours a week, usually on the weekends. And I did this through college until they pretty much completely shut down. And even after that, I sort of stayed in touch with him. He came to my senior recital, which was very supportive. And he just meant a lot to me. And I didn't know, his death came on fairly quickly from what I understand. So it was, someone told, I still remember this. I was at the University of Southern California talking to someone, and another friend of mine came up and said, oh, you worked for, or you knew Henry Temianka, right? And I said, yeah. And he said, well, he just died. So it was a shock to me. And I did something that I'd never done before, never done since. I went into a practice room and I wrote this whole piece, and then came out and I sort of shelved it. I didn't really do much with it until a number of years later. I rediscovered it, and I made a few changes because I was a little older, knew what I wanted more. So I made a few changes to it. And right around that time, an orchestra called the Chamber Orchestra Kremlin, which is now the Russian String Orchestra, so the orchestra that did this CD, they had a competition. It was Mozart's 250th birthday, I think. So they had a competition for works for strings that were 250 seconds long, which works out to about 4 minutes and something seconds. And this piece happened to be right in that length. So I submitted it, and it won the grand prize and the music director's prize, who is Misha Raklevsky. And so from that, this whole relationship with this orchestra was born. And then that's what ultimately led to the recording of this entire CD. So, yeah, Temianka continues to support me.
Well, let me just add a little something about in memory of Henry Temianka, because I'm kind of curious. I hope I'm not losing my hearing yet, but the piece is beautiful, of course, and it is meditative, even a little bit of lamentation of sorts, of course, naturally, all of that good stuff, and that repetitive two-note figure, descending figure that is so like a sigh. I think, in a way. And it, of course, calmly brings itself to conclusion and slips. This is where I hope my ears got me, and slips into a final tonal cadence. Did I hear that right?
No, absolutely. It's the last G sharp, it's the only accidental in the whole thing. Everything else is sort of basically white key, I guess you'd call it, or it's whatever the term is, and that's the only one. Yeah, and so you get this at the end, a kind of major third.
It's just the most glorious. Finale and something ascent or something. It's just stunning, and takes the listener after the being in a certain place harmonically and sound and so on, and it's so subtle. As I recall, it comes on so subtly, and it's just all of a sudden it's like,
yeah. Well, I steal from the best Schubert, if you remember, from Winterreise, right? The opening song to Winterreise. It's all in minor and minor, and then in the very last lyric, he goes into the parallel major. And again, growing up, right, that was something I knew as a child. So that mood, right, was something that's always stuck with me. So I think it kind of got made it in there.
Also, you brought back this heritage, Schubert. Wow, oops, sorry, loud cars going by again. Big night in the city of Santa Barbara, apparently. But I just was really, really touched. So let's just do an overview and wind it out here. Speaking with German-American composer Tom Schnauber. You're in Boston area, or where are you on the East Coast? Does it matter?
I am Boston and the surrounding area. Yeah. I mean, right now I'm literally in Boston. Yes.
And we talked tonight about his 2017 Quartzmusic release. So get all this information on how to buy the CD and your website, all that good stuff up at performingartsreview.net. The CD is Tom Schnauber, Death and Waltzes. Works looking up works roughly for in this case either written directly for string orchestra or reworkings of works for string orchestra, and then there's a lovely trio. We didn't even mention that last piece. Maybe we'll do that in just a second. It's very, very important, I think. Anyway, works composed between about 1995 and 2014. Misha Raklevsky is the conductor of the Russian String Orchestra, and you have had this connection with this orchestra and these musicians. They play beautifully. It's a beautiful CD of really important music for all of us who are programming work. There are just some gorgeous. I mentioned at the beginning, Fines, this little 4 brief movement glory of a piece for strings, great, and other works on the program. So everybody buy that, but I want to talk about that last piece just as a closing, if you don't mind, Tom. Let me get down to it because it's so touching and it speaks so beautifully to the temperament really of this CD. Nachwort, afterward, die Harfe. This is a poem of your father's. Tell us about that, would you?
Yeah. So my father had been sick for a while I was even before I started working on this project, and during the recording while they were recording it took them a couple of months. I actually honestly can't remember, but somewhere in there he died, and he was a writer, and he did mostly academic work, but towards the end of his life, he wrote a lot of fiction as well. And all his life, he wrote poetry, and he was born, I think, at least 100 years too late. He was a German romanticist in the in all the sense of his heroes were Goethe, Schiller, Heine, all those people, and so he wrote poetry sometimes, and sort of emulating the style of the 19th century German poets. And there was one poem that I found when I was going through his things. It was actually in one of his books, and it was called Die Harfe, the harp. And I just thought it was a lovely little. It's a two verse, each 4-line little German poem about a harp that is no longer being played. That's an old harp. It's leaning against an old tree. It's broken, but its tone can still be heard, in the air. A very German romantic, and I always said that he was sort of a would-be Heine in a post-Celan world. And I often felt as a composer, and still do, I'm sort of a would-be Brahms in a post-Schoenberg world. And so I took that poem and I set it for 3 female voices, and then looked at it and I said, this would actually sound really nice on strings. So at the last minute, I did an arrangement for 2 violins and viola, and I asked Misha, I said, look, can you just throw this in as it were at the end of the recording session? And he said, absolutely. He took his the three string players from the group, and they worked on it for, my guess would be, not very long, because at least technically it's not very difficult. Musically, it's very challenging, but these are incredibly musical musicians, and so they played it and they recorded it, and so in a way it was kind of this afterword to the whole CD, which is why the term Nachwort. Yeah. And they play it beautifully. I couldn't be happier with the way they really felt it. They really, Russian string players. You can't get any better than that.
Touche. That's exactly right. Or should I say, bravi to the 3 of them.
Yeah.
Beautiful performance, and again in a beautiful kind of chorale manner. Simple, beautiful tune, quite accessible. Absolutely gorgeous. 2 violins. What do we got? 2 violins and viola. That's such an interesting combination of sound. Also in this kind of range, it's not. It's just what I'm trying to say is it's not. That is the colors are not so important as just this combination of these 3 instruments somehow is restful and meditative and all the rest. Is gorgeous. Okay, we better wind it down. Let me just do a quick rundown once more. Tom Schnauber, great fun talking with you. Wonderful. Tom Schnauber, Tom Schnauber, Death and Waltzes, works composed between about 1995 and 2014. String orchestra, and string as one of these pieces, string orchestra with a wonderful oboe obbligato, and then this little wonderful, beautiful piece for 2 violins and viola. It's just a dandy string CD. I hope everybody will go there. I'll put the video up shortly and then catch up. I hope sometime before they take me to the nursing home on the reviews I have to write. Anywho, Tom, many thanks for giving me your evening.
Thank you very much. I enjoyed it.